and the program manager, the person who made this beautiful event possible, my colleague at ASIP, Dr. Tebogo Mabota. Tebogo, thank you very, very much. Well, whatever you say of South Africa, the one thing is true, there's never a dull moment, okay? And whether it is Gareth Cliff or Quinton de Kock, or the alleged sabotage once again, alleged at Eskom, or the ongoing mystery of the Tembisa 10 or 9 or 8, depending on how you count, there is never a dull moment. But every now and again, a major rupture happens in our society, something so serious, so spectacular, so disturbing that we have to stand still and ask what just happened, why did it happen, and how does the future look right now? And it is the role of intellectuals in society, and I use that word with great confidence in reference to our 5 speakers who are public intellectuals of very high regard. It's the role of intellectuals in society to help us make sense of things. And this is what we are here for today. Now, as somebody who's a columnist for the Times every Thursday, you are compelled as a columnist, as I'm sure our esteemed journalists here will tell me, to weigh in when the subject is still hot, okay? But it's actually not good social science to jump in every time there is a spark in society. What is good is to wait for the smoke, quite literally, to die down, and then to bring in the best minds in the country, and to ask the deep questions, which is why we are here today, several months since the calamitous events of July 2021. You know the story, the background story, you know all of that. I'm not going to get into any of that in any detail because I don't want to steal the thunder of our guests, but you know that, well over 300 people died, you know that more than 3,000 were arrested, and you know that the costs to the country ran into the millions. What really happened? Why didn't we see this coming? How did things settle down so quickly? Can it happen again? And what can be done as we look forward? So welcome once again to all of you. I'm going to start with Professor Barney Pichana, and if you don't mind, these CVs are quite weighty and interesting and so on. But just for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend too much time reading the CV, since all of you know our guests here today. I'm going to start with Professor Barney Pichana. Barney, are you there? Could I just see your face? Because I didn't see it earlier when I scrolled down.
Good day, Prof. I don't think Prof is here yet.
Oh, okay, there must be a problem. Okay, so if you don't mind, I'll start with Palesa Marudu. Now, apart from being one of the fascinating people on Twitter, I follow Palesa religiously. If I want not noise, but
I'm here. Jonathan, I'm right here.
Okay, Barney. So let me.
I heard you.
So and Palesa will speak after Barney, but I'm just going to finish the introduction. She's director of Clarity Global Strategic Communications, and as I said, very much a public figure when it comes to thinking and writing about South Africa. Her firm is based in Cape Town and Washington, D.C., and it's absolutely wonderful to have her there in the early mornings. So Palesa will speak immediately after Barney, but let me, again, now that I see Professor Pichana, all of you know Barney as one of the most courageous fighters and thinkers in the struggle for our democracy, a friend of Steve Biko, somebody who made a huge impression on me as a youngster. QWC in those days. And Barney, of course, was also head of the Human Rights Commission, the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, and now Professor Emeritus of Law at UNISA as well. So Barney, without reading your very interesting and long CV, over to you, sir. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much, colleagues. Lovely to see Palisa and Adam from faraway places, and Ferial, welcome, lovely to see you as well. Let's hope we'll have a wonderful and a lively discussion. In November 2018, I was invited by the governor of the Reserve Bank to address their annual leadership conference of the leadership of the South African Reserve Bank. In that address that I did with them then, which I had entitled South Africa Reimagined, Rethinking the Future of South Africa. When I was preparing these short notes, which I'm going to present, I went back to that time, 2018. I was absolutely flummoxed, really, to find how so little changes in this country. This is what my first paragraph said, and I quote: "Like many South Africans, in the recent past, South Africa seemed like a scene from a tragic comedy movie or classical Greek theater. There have been occasions when one wondered with disbelief what exactly was truly unfolding in front of one's eyes. There were moments when it was all too clear that we were driving ourselves as a nation to the edge of the precipice, and we knew it, a kind of national mass suicide. Yes, there were very many occasions when one believed that we were all under some spell of some shaman who had waved his magic wand and dulled all of us to sleep. The last 10 years especially saw the denouement of the South African story straight out of a horror movie. We could pinch ourselves, however, often to check if it was real. And to our horror, it was. And this is what I say now, having read that, truly at the heart of what has happened in South Africa is the destruction of an ethical consciousness. And that really is the key theme in what I am saying. We are no longer guided by the principle of I am my brother's keeper. We're not only complicit in the crimes against the state, but that our silence often turns us into co-conspirators in the crimes against ourselves. The point I'm making that the problem, dear friends, is not with the stars, but with us who are prepared to be underlings in a situation like that. And so I then move on from there, and I just recall two other recent statements in 2021. A recent blog by Raymond Suttner a week or two ago, and I quote, in his first paragraph, he says, "There is a general sense of things fall apart in South Africa today. Something more than corruption, more than widespread ineffectiveness, but a broader systemic failure in the state at various levels, but also manifestations of social disintegration, the breaking of an already fragile bonds between the inhabitants of the country and apparently more extensive human behavior." Then my last quote is to pull from Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman, the founder of Gift of the Givers. And this is what he says today. To say that South Africa is in a mess is an understatement. We are hugely aware of the colossal failings in our country, brought about largely by corruption, cronyism, nepotism, ego, greed, mismanagement, and the paucity of skills among those entrusted with the effective functioning of our country. And then I want to say really analytically, what I want to suggest lies behind what we saw in July. I think there is a culture of self-help in this country. And that culture of self-help is a product of the disappearing or the invisible state. Since the Zuma era, South Africa has been allowed to deteriorate. There was a systemic attack on all state institutions and agencies to repurpose the state to service not the people, but the president, his cronies, and political elite. In doing so, we diminish the agency of the state. The latest report, for example, is about the imminent collapse of Eskom. The result is the state has become privatized, with the result that we have two parallel state systems. By the way, what is privatized is not the state per se, but it is the functions of the state have been privatized. The public and the private, schools, health, housing, roads, buses, transport, safety and security, energy and power. To anyone who has money, you can buy it. But to those who don't and depend on the state, you will manage with next to nothing. In our country, uniquely, sections of the inner city in many of our cities have been commandeered by foreign nationals, such that Sunnyside in Pretoria, for example, has been called by my friends in Nigeria, the Lagos of South Africa. And chunks of small business enterprises have become a monopoly of foreign nationalists. That is why people can commandeer trucks on the N3 or on the N10 down here. And so what we have is the operations of a vibrant parallel state in this country. So when there's a parallel state like that, everybody then, if there's an opportunity, you go for it and make. So you find in these malls, the police were there, but far too many of them were watching rather than doing anything. And when asked, they said, no, we don't have, they never fired any, those things that they used to do under apartheid where they give you purple dye or something like that. There are no water cannons, no rubber bullets, nothing. So what we miss as a result is the recognition of the importance of an assertive state, that the state has a monopoly of power, has a monopoly of violence. To use the power of the state within the law and the constitution where appropriate is to ensure that the law is upheld, that taxes are paid, and law and order is maintained through the police and justice system. To assist the state in its duties, the state needs a parliament, an intelligence, and security system that is informed. The state needs the capability to shape the industrial, commercial, and suburban landscape of the country, and to guarantee services to the communities. Now, with the state nowhere to be seen, a culture of self-help has developed in our country. To be credible, the state must be functional, and it must be people-oriented. What we have, we hear a lot about a capable state, but very little about how to functionalize the capableness of the state, if I may use it like that. But I am not convinced that we are working towards or planning towards it, except in words. So that's my statement, and therefore I say, given that analysis, which I think is clear, it is quite clear that we do not have any trust in the politics that are functional, that are transformative. The politics of this country are completely incapable of addressing the needs of the people of this country. That for me is a matter of fact. The second thing, equally, I'm one of those who strangely enough are beginning to feel very, very strongly that the politics in the organized sense are no longer likely to fit the purpose of what the people have. Like many of us, and I'm busy talking to a whole number of people today, we are really searching for alternatives. What is the alternative? What we talk about civil society, but what does that mean? What alternatives are there to rescue the state from those who have it? We're facing the elections in local government in a few days' time. The indications are that once again, we're going to have non-elections. Jonathan, those are the few words that I have, and they set the tone, or rather the scene for me, of what I understand to be what happened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was very powerful and very original too. We're very interested also in political scientists coming in on the notion of the parallel state. Powerful stuff. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Palesa, can I go right back to you and welcome again?
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Janssen. First, I just want to frame this discussion on the project that I'm currently working on. I'm doing some research on increased race consciousness and identity politics in the United States and South Africa. The questions I'm looking at are: what is the global impact of race relations and the public conversations around these issues in the United States? And how does this shape national debate and policy in both countries, the United States and South Africa? My focus area is the phenomenon of identity politics viewed through a dual lenses of South Africa and the United States. The project will explore several questions. How does the current debate on race relations in the United States and South Africa advance efforts to overcome racism in both countries? Is the debate on critical race theory an extension of a civil war between elites about identity politics? And what is the impact of the debate as currently framed on the question of free speech? And what is importantly the relevance of the non-racial democratic legacies of Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. to these matters? Now, the research will address this question through a critical examination of national discourse in both South Africa and the United States. Now, you may be wondering, why is this relevant to our discussion today? First of all, it's because I have my feet in both countries, and I often joke that my levels of anxiety are always on the high, without fail, constantly, because of the politics in both countries. It's not for the faint-hearted. So when the Zuma riots, and I describe them as the Zuma riots, erupted in July in South Africa, and the narrative of a coup and insurrection took hold, it was easy for many people in the United States to see the riots through the lens of what happened on January 6th, when the Capitol building became under attack by some elements of President Donald Trump's support base. It is partly the reason I wrote a commissioned piece for the Washington Post in the aftermath of that orgy of violence that was broadcast across the world. So I want to make 4 points. First, it has been 3 months since the Zuma riots. So the question is, do I still believe in what I wrote, that what happened in South Africa was a counter-revolution organized from within the African National Congress, and that the African National Congress, the ruling party in South Africa as it currently stands, is the biggest threat to the future of South Africa? And I want to say to you that without a doubt, yes, I still believe in what I wrote 3 months ago. Why should we characterize what happened in July as a form of a counter-revolution? It is because the leaders of a faction inside the African National Congress that organized those riots were motivated by a desire to undermine the rule of law in South Africa, without which the country will descend into lawlessness. We must take a minute to remember that the South African Democratic Revolution was about guaranteeing full democratic rights to all and to begin to forge a nation that is united and a non-racial society. So when you begin to organize to crush the rule of law in the manner in which the organizers of those riots were hoping, and to elevate the rights of one person, their leader, to be above those of everyone else, you are basically planting a seed for the complete reversal of what the fundamental struggle against racist apartheid laws was about. So let us imagine, just for a minute, if the plotters of the riots had succeeded. The country burned down. Jacob Zuma was fetched from prison to calm the nation. What would have stopped them from demanding more? That the democratically elected government needed to go, and that the criminal cases against the comrades needed to stop. What would stop them setting a precedent that violence and mayhem is what must happen in order to suspend the rule of law and for the winners to do as they please? Second, I said that in that piece that the ANC has become the biggest threat to the future of South Africa. I do not say this lightly. And I want to emphasize, I do not say this lightly. I personally was born in an ANC home. I have family who paid the ultimate price. But I'm also not blinded by nostalgia and a refusal to see what is in front of my own eyes. There are very many nice people in the ANC. Some of them are my friends, and some of them are my former comrades. They're lovely, very decent people. But the party as it stands is rotten to the core. It has no compelling political vision for the country. Many of its top leadership are completely unsuitable for the job at hand. It is a politically exhausted party whose job was to help liberate South Africa and usher in a new dispensation, but is ultimately not up to the task of taking South Africa into the future. This brings me to my third point, and that is there are huge economic, political, and environmental emergencies across the globe. And the issue of political leadership on these emergencies is not just a challenge for South Africa. The United States, for example, is confronted with some serious leadership challenges itself. It is increasingly becoming quite clear that the two-party system is no longer a viable political management system for what the United States is confronting today. So not unlike in South Africa, moments of economic and political crisis and absence of any coherent political leadership open up spaces for populist and demagogic figures to emerge with simple solutions that capture the imagination. It happened in Germany after the humiliating defeat in World War I. Hitler emerged a few years later and Europe became a bloodbath. In the United States, Trump emerged in the lead up to the 2016 elections with his call to make America great again. Many of the people in Middle America who voted for him voted for President Barack Obama twice in 2008 and 2012. And as things stand right now, Trump might actually just come back in 2024, or someone like him, just a bit more confident. So it is not far-fetched that our crisis in South Africa will create conditions for a populist figure to emerge who will appeal to the politics of resentment. And what we saw in July is what can potentially happen when the valve is opened. South Africa is filled with tinder, and all it needs is for one person and anyone to light the match. The only thing that helped us, and I think Professor Bani Pitana refers it to self-help, in July was the resilience of the South African people. And I think we lived with too much political violence in the late 80s and the early 90s. Right now, what we fear most is criminal violence. but the political violence remains fresh in our memory. And that mobilization of our collective resource that happened in July is literally what saved us all. Which brings me to my final point, and I think that is the question that Professor Bani Pichana is also grappling with. And that is we must begin to imagine the future of South Africa without the African National Congress. I don't think we do that enough, but we need to imagine that future without the African National Congress. It is becoming quite clear that we are going to live with political system characterized by coalition politics. Many countries do, Scotland, Greece, etc. What intellectual capacity are we going to invest in understanding coalition politics to make sure that they can work for the benefit of the most marginalized in our society? Otherwise, if we don't do that work, it will become an elite gathering to dish out lucrative positions and tenders to one another and exclude all of us. So where will alternative political leadership emerge? I don't know. I don't have the answers for that. In my view, there's a need for political action that is independent of any of the existing political parties. So such a break needs to be based on the fundamental interest of the vast majority to advance the health of the entire nation. So I still believe that notwithstanding the enormous challenges facing the country right now, there is enormous value in South Africa's national democratic project, both how we can build on it and what it teaches the world. And that's where I'm going to end, Professor Jansen. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Melissa. That too was very, very powerful. And I'm really glad that you also, positioned yourself within the story, within the narrative. And your family history and your independence and so on and so forth. The ANC, the ruling party, the biggest threat to the future of South Africa. I am quite sure we will have quite a bit of discussion around that, but that is a perspective on a very real crisis. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Our next speaker is Ferial Haffajee, and Ferial, as many of you know, is the associate editor of the Daily Maverick. She is, of course, better known to most of us as the very, very competent and fiery editor of the Mail and Guardian. And Ferial, like Melissa, have achieved so much in their lives. I don't want to waste their time and read it all to you. But Ferial, welcome to you, and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, and lovely to be with everybody here. So I was really quite shocked when I checked just now. It's 113 days since those 8 days in July, which brought us to the edge of our seats. And what strikes me is how quickly we have forgotten about them. I'm going to just answer the question about whether it can happen again, and I do think it can. And why is this? Because I believe that it's been an event, a crisis without consequences at all. The 12 instigators whom we were told were going to be arrested, our president said there would be a day and night search, no stone would be left unturned. Not a single one of them was ever arrested. A lot of foot soldiers were arrested, and I'll come to some of that later. Thousands of people were arrested for the looting, and prosecutions were promised in days. In fact, I check in with the police and the NPA almost every 2 weeks. And all the time we're fobbed off. We're pushed from department to department, from ministry to ministry. Because what I think here has happened, there's been a political decision to downgrade what was called a failed insurrection into a political storm. And I think that there's a very determined purpose about that, a political purpose, which I'll get to, and it's very dangerous for our country. I quickly want to suggest how this has happened. I think one thing I've learned in these 100 days, because I was fascinated and horrified by those 8 days in July, is that we're a very resilient people. And I think part of that resilience means that we walk past crises really fast. We roll on to the next things, roll up our sleeves and we move on. probably apartheid, definitely Marikana, 3 sets of damning occasions of xenophobic violence, but we've moved on from them without sorting out what happened, no prosecutions, no real rule of law. So if you look at what happened in July, almost as soon as the intense period was over, the reclaim and the rebuild movement started on Facebook became the story. So the narrative shift happened in days, and that comes down to part of this of what is our character, and something I think that bears studying or considering for what it means for our well-being as a country. Politically, how was this allowed to happen? KwaZulu-Natal is the most powerful region of the ANC. It brings the highest numbers of people to conferences. And so that province, and it was sculpted that way by the former President Jacob Zuma, is key if you want to, for example, have a second term as ANC president and country president. That province was extremely unhappy at how President Ramaphosa had managed the 8 days in July, and also how he had characterized it as a failed insurrection and as ethnic mobilization. The KZN party tabled a highly critical report of him to the ANC's National Executive Committee, and from that day you could almost see the president and his cabinet take their wheels off the accelerator of justice. And I think what the president was making was a calculation that the country is better served with him having 2 terms rather than being turfed out next year, which is when the ANC is due to have its next elective conference. And these cabinet very quickly followed. So our government until recently, until the election period, was managed by a National Security Council, which meets every day. It's got a number of ministers on it, and it also has the heads of all your intelligence services, etc., who sit in the secretariat. In fact, there are 5 key people missing off that secretariat. And I think that tells you a story of how insecure we are right now. That National Security Council is not working in the ways that it should. And although this happened, a lot of work that we did showed that in the WhatsApp organizing groups, in fact, people could be directly traced to the structures of the ANC, the youth structures, the youth league, and very many were employed in the eThekwini municipality. So the political roots of what happened were pretty clear for everybody to see. So there was a short and a long tail, a short tail and a long tail damage. And I think it's worth just for a second us recalling that 357 people died. Until today, we haven't had an accounting or an audit from our government on exactly who they were and what the circumstances of their death were. And we do ask as media really all the time. My colleagues at the Daily Maverick tried to piece it together and got to just over 100 deaths. After that, it's very difficult to get any more information. 50 billion has been wiped off GDP. 150,000 jobs were affected. 40,000 businesses were affected. There were 300 million rand in educational facilities which were destroyed. And I thought this was quite a moving statistic. 7 million rand in spaza shops goods were lost. This calculation has been done. 112 shopping centers targeted, and then just massive damage. The long tail is environmental. The IPL chemical factory in Konubia in KZN, we're counting the costs. I mean, the beaches are still closed. The damage to the sewage and water systems is still being tallied by very many people. Civil society at least getting in there. And at the moment, business is sitting on 1 trillion rand of investment capital, which is simply not going into the economy, and so unemployment's getting worse. And I think that some of the long tail story of what happened in July, even though we've walked past it, the damage is still clear and you can see it almost every day. I don't think that we as civil society should allow this to go forgotten, to walk past it again, because what you're seeing is an appeasement politics over the rule of law, a short-termism over the long-term respect for that rule of law. And what's happened since? I think that the hostage taking of 2 ministers and a deputy minister just 2 weeks ago is part of the same story. The key organizer there, Lwazi Mjobe, works in the eThekwini municipality. So does another of those hostage takers. 41 of the 53 people have some kind of criminal record. I did see a political hand in that. You saw the medical parole granted to the former President Jacob Zuma by a sleight of hand, which involved overriding the medical parole appeal board, some part of the same pattern. What I think is happening here, like Palesa said, is that the RET faction of the ANC is positioning for a massive fight in 2022. And that insurrectionary, or what the former President Thabo Mbeki called a counter-revolutionary insurgency, is happening at a smaller scale. Obviously, I don't think we're going to see July happening again, but these sorties are being flown all the time. And I do think you're going to see the pace of them accelerated as we head into 2022. I thought I might just share with you a little story. So one of the people arrested was the social media firebrand called Spiti Spiti Evaluator, or Zamaswazi Zintle Majozi. I went along to the Germiston Magistrates Court when she appeared for the first time. And very interestingly, an unknown NGO called Democracy in Action bailed her out. Who was there giving money to the person who bailed her out, or consulting and making a plan with him, was Carl Niehaus, who for me is very much the face of what's happening at the moment. And I don't know if I watch it too carefully, but it was pretty clear to see what had happened from July, then the hostage taking, to all these court cases, and a number of actions that you're seeing in Mpumalanga. All of us have focused on KZN and Gauteng, but in fact, Mpumalanga saw a lot of damage and a lot of attacks too. And for me, because we've chosen the politics of appeasement over the rule of law, you are going to see this constant occurrences, maybe not at that intensity, but we certainly aren't past what happened in July, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Firio. What I think you did really beautifully is to connect the dots between what looks like random events, but relate to each other in very powerful ways and very scary ways with respect to the future. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Adam Habib. Adam, as you know, is director of the prestigious School for Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Most of you know him as the former Vice Chancellor of Wits University. And again, impressive CV, but I'm not going to waste his time. Adam, welcome from London, and over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. It's a real pleasure to be here with Bani and Ferial and Palesa and colleagues. You know, I have my remarks are very much in line with what Bani, Ferial, and Palesa have said, although I have a few quibbles that I will touch on towards the end. You know, I'm going to start with the question: what really happened, and will it happen again? And my answer is we're heading for it again. I think that there's no doubt about it. And if you want to understand why, the question is, what were the causal variables that enabled July to happen? And have any of those been addressed? So it seems to me that there's three causal variables that enable July to happen. A long-term variable being the deep structural inequality in our society. And that deep structural inequality has led to a major political and social polarization of our society. And that has lived with us for many, many years. Now, the problem is deep structural inequality on its own doesn't lead to the kind of violence. There has to be intervening variables. And the two intervening variables that came into play, one was COVID-19, which accelerated the deep inequality to a crisis point. It really created a food insecurity crisis in our society. People were actually starving. And large numbers of people had lost their jobs. People were dying. And that, if you like, took what is an existing stable structural inequality and pushed it to a pushing point. So that was the first intervening variable. The second was an attempt at what Ferial has called, and Palais have called, an attempt at an organized rebellion. This was a group of players within the ruling party decided to intervene. And it doesn't matter whether they tried to do a coup, a counter-revolution, or whether they were just simply trying to weaken the president himself. But whichever plan, it went viral. And it went viral because of that deep, deep inequality and the COVID-19. If it had happened in any other society, it wouldn't have gone viral as quickly as it did. But in the context of South Africa, with its deep inequality, its deep social and political polarization, together with COVID, that just was, it lit that fire and it just went viral. And that effectively is why it happened. Now, the question you have to ask is it likely to happen again? Well, then the answer to that is, have any of those features changed? So the deep structural inequality is frankly even more so today than it was 12, 18 months ago. And frankly, COVID-19 hasn't resolved itself. But what you're also happening is, coupled with this COVID-19, is a complete fracturing of local government. So Ferial writes graphically about the collapse of Johannesburg. I mean, just think about it. This is the premier city of South Africa, the heart of our economy. And what you have is a daily fracturing of the local society. Water doesn't get delivered. Electricity doesn't get delivered. Security isn't delivered. There is a complete disintegration of the society. So none of the issues have been resolved. If you were going to resolve inequality, you would need a medium-term plan. If you were going to deal with the organized rebellion, then frankly, some of those people should have been arrested. And frankly, they haven't been, as Ferial has demonstrated today and so often. And she's right. Effectively, what we've got is a politics of appeasement. What you've got is actively forces have said we want a political solution to this matter, which doesn't resolve this, and forget the 357 people that have been killed. Now, I just want us to remind ourselves that if we're serious, you must remember that all societies that disintegrate, you have people who profit for it. Go to every war economy in the world, you will find there are some people who make an enormous amount of money. They profit out of disintegration. They profit from war. And I think that there are serious political players in the ruling party, and Palais has identified some associated with Karl Neus, Jacob Zuma, but frankly, in some of the opposition parties that are actually benefiting from this integration. This is how they make their cash. This is where they make their wealth. This is the crude, what Marx would have called the primitive accumulation of wealth. And this is a series of political players that are actually doing this. Now, you might ask, well, how do we get out of this mess? Well, it seems to me you have to do three things. Firstly, if you were being serious about wanting to get out of the mess, you would have to act against the people who fermented rebellion, because they're not sipping cappuccinos in some lovely place in northern Natal coastline. What they're doing is they're fermenting rebellions in its multiplicity of ways all the time. And so you actually have to act against them. Second, you need an attempt to address the structural inequality. And that requires a growth plan that has at its heart employment and simultaneously has at its heart inclusion. What people in rhetorical terms talk about the social pact to get business and labor and the state together. Well, if you're going to have that, you need three things, none of which we have. One is a meritocratic state, and a meritocratic state does not exist. Every person we are appointing in the state is not appropriately qualified, etc. And we've consoled ourselves that meritocracy is racially flavored. Well, the answer to that is to deracialize meritocracy, not to say meritocracy is not required. And so are we surprised that meritocracy has been completely abandoned and our states have collapsed? The electricity, water, none of which works. The second is you need to contain corruption. While you need to contain corruption, then you need to do two things. You firstly need to arrest the bloody buggers who are stealing. And secondly, you have to close the taps that enable it. Well, if you look at our procurement systems in the state, partly enunciated around BEE, what it says is you can charge $15 for a loaf of bread because somehow you would then be on some empowerment track. The problem with that is you don't go and take that money and invest in a new business that gets jobs. You take it to go buy the latest Ferrari or the latest thing. So the kind of thing that irritates me about our corruptees is they're not even clever. Instead of investing it somewhere that is productive, they just go and blow it up and they bankrupt 2 days later because they've blown it up on Ferraris or Aston Martins. And that's just stupidity. And then there's the third, you need to deal with the violence that has become endemic in our society. And yeah, I don't think it's only what happened in July. I think every strike is violent. Every social struggle is violent. And actually, to be honest, we've all been indulgent of the violence. We've kind of said to ourselves that somehow, if the cause is right, if we like the political cause, somehow the violence is okay. And we've kind of confused ourselves that democracies don't need security. Any decent democracy deals with security. That's what Barney says. It's the responsibility of the state to secure its citizens. Now, are we likely to do all of this? At the moment, my gut feel is no. Simply, it's unlikely to happen. Now, what will happen then? Well, the first is the slow decline of the society, a la what Ferial writes about Johannesburg collapsing. Johannesburg reminds me of, frankly, Karachi. It reminds me of Lagos. And that, as you speak to colleagues in those cities, they will tell you it took that 20, 30 years to get to. We on that path. Our city is there. That's the one route. The second is where people get so hurtful that they hand their future to a strong man, a la Brazil, Bolsonaro, or Modi, India. That's the danger. People is which goes first. Is it that we slowly disintegrate a la Karachi, Lagos? Or do we go get so hurtful and hand over to a strong man a la Brazil or India? And that's the danger. Two final responses that I have to say. Palesa is right that the ANC is in trouble. I mean, this is my dilemma, Palesa. Cyril, in many ways, is the best we have, but he doesn't come anywhere close to what we require. And that's the problem with the president as he stands. I mean, who's the alternative? Steenhuisen? Is it the EFF? My fear is the alternative.
I'm in a conference, love.
So much worse than where we are. And the coalition government is by fear. I think we're in a really dangerous moment, because what it will become is an elite sharing of the spoils, as we've seen in Johannesburg on previous occasions. The final thing I'd say is, if we're worried about resilience, that's fantastic. But remember, Pakistani society and Nigerian society is very resilient. It's because they don't have any other option. It's because their politicians fail them. And that's not a badge of honor. It's a badge of shame of our leadership in our society. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam, very much. That was intriguing. And I particularly liked your point about, from a paraphrase, why weren't we paying attention when all the other kinds of violence were happening before the July tragedy? And that point has also been made in the chat boxes by people like Crispin Emerson and Michael Kahn. So thank you very much for that. And finally, we go to my colleague here at Stellenbosch University, Professor Thuli Madonsela, who I believe is on the line as soon as I see her. Thuli, are you there?
Good afternoon, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Prof. Madonsela. As many of you know, Prof. Madonsela is the Law Trust Chair in Social Justice and Law Professor at Stellenbosch University. But most of you would know, of course, as our very, very accomplished public protector in South Africa. Prof. Madonsela, over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Prof. Can I share this document? Although it's very brief, it's just 2 slides. It's just a few slides.
Okay.
Do I have permission?
Yes, you have permission, and I'll let you know when it comes up.
Right.
Here we go.
Right. Thank you, dear colleague, and thank you, Prof. Jonathan and the other colleagues for this very timely conversation that hopefully will lead to some kind of social leadership that can gain traction and get us out of this maze. I would like to address you on 4 issues. Was it a black swan in July? Can the truth set us free? What practical possibilities lie ahead and the future? Let's start with the question of whether it was a black swan. A black swan, as we all know, is something that we hardly ever see. At my age, I've never seen a black swan. I see the white ones all the time. And a black swan is rare, but it's something that devastates the economy. And the person who coined the term says, when you look back, you actually realize that it could have been predicted. So if we look at what happened in July, when it happened in July, Colin Coleman sent me a text that I sent to him in June saying, we are treading on dangerous ground. We possibly will have an unrest when Zuma goes to jail. But long before Zuma, I had said that South Africa is going to implode. And the first time I said something like this was in Germany in 2011. And for me, it just came from what I saw happening on the ground as a public protector, emerging anger over a promise unmet, a debt unpaid, because of the constitutional promise that we adopt this constitution as a foundation for healing the divisions of the past and establishing a new society that is based on 3 pillars: democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And whilst some progress has been made in 27 years of democracy on all of those 3 fronts, to some people, they're not visible. And we started seeing reactions of those who felt that democracy was not improving their lives, when those who have almost made it through education, who have almost experienced social mobility through education, were falling through the cracks and nobody was doing anything. And I remember addressing Parliament as public protector just after Against the Rules, when a lot of people didn't like me that much. And it was after Against the Rules and also after my Midval report on This Can't Be Right. So quite a number of people did not like me personally, but then they forgot the deal. And this was pre-Fees Must Fall, when the student of Pretoria had started a campaign called I Am Jackson, because students were sleeping in toilets, hungry, unable to register. Some of the professional associations, such as lawyers and accountants, were giving them 5,000 rand to register, but after that, they had no place to sleep. And at some stage, we had one of those children living with us. Then the state capture investigation started. Then Bell Pottinger, not correctly spelled, Bell Pottinger came to the party with its dead cat strategy to try and stop the campaign. Then COVID-19 and the lockdown social and economic impact made people really, really live on the edge, sad, and even the middle class that was already very small shrunk considerably during COVID-19. Add that mental health challenges and Zuma being arrested, for me, I think that we had it coming. So what happened in this country was coming a long time. It was just a question of when, who was going to light the gas, but the gas was there coming from various cylinders in our society. And then the next point, of course, is, can the truth set us free? The truth will set us free if we are honest about what are the causes and enablers. If we think that the cause was Zuma and Karl Neals and the parties, I don't think they were the cause, and I'm glad that colleagues realized that that was not the cause. Those were some of the instigators, but often already exploding situation. Our colleague Palisa talks about the governing party being a threat to democracy. In a very strange way, Palisa, I agree with you. I honestly believe that what we were taught when we were being in the struggle was that the security forces of a state that has been dislodged, they repurpose themselves and get into the Liberation Party and kill it from within. I have no doubt in my mind that some of the people that claim to be fighting for radical economic empowerment, when in fact it's even improper to call them the RET brigade. These are people who are trying to kill the governing party from inside, but also milking the state of South Africa as white-collar thieves. So we have a weakened political party. I hadn't included that, but I'm just saying that I do agree with you, Alisa, that that is a problem. But there's a local entrepreneurship that is looking at the hunger, and that was the pitch of my speech in Germany in 2011, was that all of this anger is going to be harvested by political entrepreneurs, because any entrepreneur looks at a gap and say, how can I monetize it? In this case, it's not monetizing people's pain and anguish. It is turning it into voting fodder. And you get your demagogues and you get all manner of things. But in South Africa, the political entrepreneurship is also about fighting internal political battles, but social injustice makes it easy. The rule of law is a funny thing in that, in one way, the strength of the rule of law is part of the reason July happened. Because a lot of the people that fought for Zuma saw it coming for them. But as the rule of law is beginning to bite, they too are going to go to jail. And all they're trying to do is to dislodge Ramaphosa, because they know that for themselves, they will control the security forces. If Ramaphosa goes, they will definitely target these institutions. But also the weaknesses in the rule of law are part of the reason we had the problem in July, which colleagues have already mentioned. But one of the problems is, why is the State Capture Commission taking forever? It was supposed to finish a started investigation, but it has covered so many grounds. And of course, if you cover too many grounds, it's going to be slow. And I don't blame the Deputy Chief Justice. That was the design of the terms of reference of the commission. So partly the strength of the rule of law, which is moving in on wrongdoers, is frightening them, and they're looking at how can they recapture the state so that they can control law enforcement in this country. But also the weaknesses, again, in law enforcement and the rule of law are making it possible for them to be able to just live these blazing lives where they have no sense of shame, they have no loss of face, they can just mobilize in broad daylight because there's no accountability for them. And then the last one is, there are weaknesses in social leadership. That's why I'm grateful that you've organized this kind of conversation, and we need more conversation. It's so weird that I was in another event where our cigar lounge discussion ended up in a space like this about how do we have better social leadership, where civil society takes the lead, because we are in this boat. If it goes down, we're all going down. But also our social compact as society is not holding, because the Constitution talks about healing the divisions of society and establishing a society that's founded on 3 pillars. How often are we telling everyone that this is where we are headed, and therefore everyone should lead in that direction? And secondly, how often do we even mention that as the purpose of our democracy? I don't think we're doing enough of that. So the last question then would be, what are the possibilities? What are the practical possibilities? At Stellenbosch University, we have the M Plan for Social Justice, where some of you, Prof. Jonathan and others, have spoken. We do hope that this is one of the avenues for reigniting a social compact. And a lot of people are saying we need a second CODESA with a double C, a consolidation of democracy, a convention for the consolidation of democracy in South Africa, because then we need to carry people with. And this is people like Prof. Evans Kalula mentions how the Second World War happened, because much as the Treaty of Versailles dealt with the injustices that had led to the First World War, it unintentionally created new injustices. And when those injustices started biting the working class and the lower middle class, it was easy for them to gravitate towards a political entrepreneur such as Hitler. And we see the same thing, people gravitating towards fascists, and we see them finding it easier to be gaslit by people like Karl Niehaus. So what does the future hold? I do think that we should continue these conversations. I do think that we should make the social compact hold and social leadership shine. And social leadership in the social justice M Plan, we see it happening at all ward levels. We need to give our people hope. we need them to feel they're part of some Noah's Ark, because if they don't feel like they're part of something that's going to change their circumstances, they will go the other direction where people are misleading them to say this is all about good change for them when they're just voting fodder for political entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Tuli, also for ending on a practical note, because that is coming up in the chat. So could I just ask our 5 speakers, if you don't mind, just for purposes of efficiency, I've taken 5 questions out of the chat or the Q&A boxes, and I'm going to ask you to think about it for a few seconds. So let me allocate your questions, if you don't mind, and then ask you, when I come back to you, to speak to the issue. So Bonnie, Bhuti Masoka says, direct representation in elections will increase accountability. Why don't we have that? Could I ask you just to think about that? I'll come back to you in a minute. Then Palesa, in relation to your comparative inputs, I thought Siva Moodley has an interesting question. He says, is it possible, I'm paraphrasing, that we're in trouble because we thought we were exceptional? Why did we not look at other countries? And I think this is a good question in the context of Lagos coming up and Karachi and so on. So that's for Palesa. Then number 3, Firiel, I wonder if you could respond to Crispin. He asks, what can we do as citizens to weaken the networks of violence and exploitation? What can we practically do to weaken the networks of violence and exploitation? Then Adam, there's a question from Vafunani Chishonga, and the question is, the opposition seems to make things worse. For example, the racial insensitivities of the DA and the EFF. So I take it that question means, why don't we have a credible opposition? Adam, if you could perhaps speak to that. And then Prof. Tuli, if I could, despite your very practical suggestions, Georgina Ryan has been a bit frustrated with us academics. She says, man, what is it we as ordinary citizens can do? What can I do as Georgina Ryan? I wonder if you could close off the Q&A with responding to that question. So Prof. Pachana, if I could go to you on direct representation.
Thank you very much. I take the view that we have a constitution, and there are very few of us who believe sincerely that that constitution is not appropriate for us and for this country. But we need to admit that our constitution and our constitutional values have not been applied so that the constitution can have efficacy as was intended. Equally, we've come to realize that after all, the constitution is simply paper, words on paper, unless you have the right sort of moral, committed leadership that actually understands what it takes and the consequences of not doing so to actually misgovern or misapply with a special intent what is in the constitution. Now, for that reason, I find it very difficult, as things currently stand, to really come to believe that direct representation of whatever kind, Westminster system, whatever, is actually the solution. I don't believe, for example, now that we're going to get a better politics just because some individuals are so-called independents. I'm cynical enough, I think, to realize that many of the so-called independents are going to turn out to be actually dark horses of one or other of the political parties. What I actually do think that the system that we have has very obvious shortcomings which should have been anticipated. I do recognize what it was trying to solve as actually quite an important factor. And so really, I don't believe that so-called direct representation in elections is the solution, although it is actually important for the integrity of our leadership and the accountability of our leadership, such as we have it at the moment. I think, I think we need to find a way of making our constitution work better and more effectively. And many of the agencies and institutions, like I said at the beginning, have been what is the word? Have been repurposed very, very effectively and very intently in the last 10 years or so with Jacob Zuma. And it's been very difficult with all that we say about Cyril Ramaphosa. He has actually taken on a poison chalice. We need a reset. We need a reset, a major reset for our country than we have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was fantastic. Palesa, the comparative story.
Yes, yeah. I mean, thank you for that question. Are we exceptional? I mean, I think the response to that question is that many countries believe they are exceptional. I live in a country that believes it is a home of the brave. It is an exceptional thing. They are the home of the brave. Rwanda believes that they are exceptional after what they have achieved after the genocide that happened 27 years ago. Zambia, one Zambia, one nation. So it is a very natural thing for many countries to believe that we are exceptional. And I think in South Africa, we believe that we're exceptional because our project was an international project. It was brought about by international solidarity in the struggle against apartheid, in the international solidarity against apartheid. So it was a special project because it was so international, and it gave so much hope to the rest of the world. And I think what we did not do in South Africa is to be able to. And I think it's a question of geography. We are at the bottom of the continent. So we don't really connect with the rest of the world that much, just as a simple matter of geography. So when we listen to the conversations that we have, we tend to be so inward looking. We only talk about ourselves. And if you look at South Africa and our project, and that culminated in 1994, and you look around the world, I mean, there hasn't really been a very positive international project that was that positive and had that international impact like we had in South Africa. If you think about the world since then, I mean, look at it, there was a glimmer of hope happening with the Arab Spring that happened in Egypt and all of that ended up in defeat. Nicaragua ended up in defeat. So there are a whole lot of things that have happened around the world that have not really culminated in some positive thing happening in the world. And I think that when we begin to look at the world and look at ourselves, we need to just perhaps understand that we are not exceptional in that case. We are having the same problems that most of the world is grappling with. And like I said in my input, it's really around the question of political leadership. And, I think the whole issue, I think, I agree with Adam around meritocracy and all of that, but the whole meritocratic project is under strain. And you see that in the United States, the meritocracy has left the ordinary man and woman out because, we all go to liberal arts schools, nice schools, and then we all talk to one another, and then we all make policy. And people that we're making policy for are not impacted positively by that policy. So it's a crisis, it's a political crisis. It's a political leadership crisis, and to some extent, we can trace it to the meritocracy that prevailed as a result of the defeat of, of what happened in 1990 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the triumph of the new politics of, democracy. But what is a democratic dividend? I don't know. I don't think it has prevailed under the leadership of meritocracy. So my answer to that question is that we need to connect what is happening in South Africa to what is going on around the world. And in that case, we may be able to find some answers, but answers are not going to emerge from ourselves only. There is an important project to be done to connect with the world.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Very, very helpful. Fidel, what can we do to weaken these networks? You are not just a top journalist, you're also an activist around these issues. What can be done?
Thank you, and great comments and ideas from Crispin Hempson in the chat there. So just to go back a little bit, the political entrepreneurs that the Prof speaks about, they amassed a massive war chest in order to fund that failed insurrection, or whatever we called it. If you read in the 8 Days in July, the great book by Kanita Hunter, Kavil Singh, and Jeff Wicks just brought out this week, they had buckies to go around with. They had tires. They were giving people airtime and allowances in order that they form part of those shock troops. And where did that political capital come from? I think it came from the provinces and municipal budgets, because that's where some of the key lieutenants had control over. And I think that you've seen those war chests assembled then also from within intelligence, as we heard great detail of 9 billion missing from intelligence. So I think that our job as citizens is to become custodians, an army of the public rand. Because what happens now is you only catch it right at the end when the Auditor General's report comes out. And in fact, what you need is citizen armies to watch that precious public rand from the start, so that it doesn't go missing and is misappropriated to fund these insurrectionary movements, because I do think they are a threat for the future. I just give an example. In Johannesburg, there's maybe 2 specialized journalists who cover the city. The mayor as a person has 11 social media people. So there's a real absence on the ground of watchdogs, of seeing where the funds go to at municipal and provincial level. So that's where I'd like to apply certainly my activist energies. And then I suppose bigger than that is, because we have voices and influences, to look at the reshaping of our economy and support as citizens and citizen activists the ideas around a basic income grant, around the densification of areas so people have homes to go to. And certainly after the elections, I do want to be a much more active citizen in the ward committee, so that I don't only write about it right at the end, but that you are active on the ground using the structures which have been set up. Because I think part of how July happened, Crispin, Jonathan, is that we stopped doing that kind of work we used to do in the 80s and even in the early 90s. And so we left space for these political entrepreneurs to fill. Well, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Adam, credible opposition.
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think Bafudani is right. I think we're in real trouble with the opposition. What I found interesting about the Cliff Central controversy was how what didn't receive any attention is the debate that the DA's entire strategy is based on analysis by the IRR, which says that the real problem amongst the citizens is service delivery and not racism. And the real irony is it assumes that these are 2 mutually exclusive, so that if you for some reason believe service delivery is a problem, you can't also simultaneously believe racism is a problem. And as these are mutually exclusive things, But what it struck me is that such a basic, you can both be angry at racism and be angry at service delivery. And the entire opposition, the leading opposition party is actually premised on using one rather than both. And that's the problem in a sense. It's completely dislocated from the reality of South Africa's citizenry and the challenges that they confront. But it seems to me that the EFF is and I've described it as a racialized, violent party that is dangerous in our society. And I think we indulge it at our peril. And frankly, I just don't think enough of us are prepared to call it out for what it is. And I worry about that. Now, the question you might ask is, what do we do out of all of this? And I think here is where I'm closer to Barney and Tuli in two senses. One, I am worried. Second, I think the electoral design of our system is important, but I don't think that's going to resolve it. I think the real dilemma is the political alternative has to come outside the political class. We have to give up on all of the political activists. And actually, the future may very well lie in the people who are not political activists today. Because in a sense, they come to the problem with completely new eyes. And frankly, they come with it with both an understanding of social justice, I would imagine, but I also would imagine with a pragmatism. And really my answer to this it comes out of the universities. When I was at Wits, the thing that struck me is people would say, well, young people are this. And my question was actually, you homogenize young people as if they're all the same. I was quite struck by how 98% of young people were pragmatic, thoughtful, socially just, socially committed individuals, but we're very different from the political activists who claim to represent them. I think the political activists have no clue, in a sense. The political activists in universities were very much a parody of the ANC or the EFF or the DA or whatever political party they were representative of. And that was disconnected from the vast majority of young people. And I think that's the answer. The answer is somehow give agency back to people who are not part of the political class, whether they're the opposition or the ruling. And how do you empower them? And how do you give them voice? And how do you give them leverage and power? That's going to be the answer. And I think that's what Tuli touches on when she says we need to go back to civil society. We need to go back to that world.
I play the piano, and I've learned how to play by ear. And if I heard Adam correctly, Prof. Tuli, he was suggesting that the political leadership comes from outside the political parties. I hope that you and Imtiaz Suleiman would stand in the next elections and give us a shot at hope. Prof. Tuli, what can ordinary citizens do?
Thank you, Prof. Jonathan. In fact, I think the answer lies in social leadership. And you jokingly spoke about me and others going into politics. A lot of social science is pointing to the fact that democracy is no longer democratic, precisely because all of our eggs are in the politics basket. And you and we will recall that when democracy was invented, there were no political parties. Somebody just told us that political parties are the best thing. And so far, yes, they've worked in some ways, but there are other ways of making democracy work for all by making sure that democracy makes everyone count and ensures that everyone's democracy dividend is accounted for. What I'm putting forward to us here, to young people, is we should double up on social leadership without intending to go into politics. But of course, we can train young people, which we're doing at the Tuma Foundation under the EPIC leadership model, which is a model of leaders that are ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve. We can train them so that they can go there. But I honestly think we need to double up on social leadership, to hold government accountable from the point of view of social accountability. That's direct accountability, most of it. To also, nothing stops us from creating a social compact in the same way that Karl Marx, Engels, and others came up with the Communist Manifesto. There's nothing stops us as academics to start dreaming and saying, this is what the Constitution says. It says we are adopting this Constitution as a basis to heal the divisions of the past and create a new society that is founded on 3 pillars: democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. For me, that's a social democracy. But none of the modern us, me included, has fleshed out what does equal look like. And gender experts are trying to deal with that for women. But what does equal look like for everyone, for people with disabilities, for Black people who are still historically dispossessed, excluded, and who are at the bottom of this pyramid? For a society that, instead of being a diamond when it comes to a bulging middle class, has virtually no middle class and a working class that is predominantly Black and was deprived of the ability to use land just for work and sustenance, and certainly is excluded from the economy. So I think we can do that, hold government accountable, but also take responsibility. And that's where the M plan comes into place, where we're asking civil society to join us to play our part in helping government to design laws from a social impact point of view, with an eye in mind that all laws should advance equality, all forms of equality. Leveraging money to make sure that we can fund all municipalities to see real change in every person's life. Thirdly, advancing social accountability or cultivating leadership in society for social accountability and social cohesion. And lastly, leadership at all levels. The last thing I want to say, Prof. Jonathan and colleagues, is we should also do what we can to expose these networks. I mean, Ethiopians say when spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion. These nefarious people are very good at that. They really work as spider webs. During my time as pop protector, they did that. Even now, you can tell who's part of that network, but can you tell who's part of this network that is trying to create a society for all, an egalitarian society where nobody feels like a Cinderella, nobody feels like an orphan. We meet once in a while, we defend democracy when we really feel it's under threat, and then we disappear into our little corners. How about creating an ongoing network that would lead to some kind of social compact that we can then confront the politicians with and say, this is what we see South Africa looking like by 2030 or by 2040, but this is what it will progressively look like at ward level, at institutional level, as we march in that direction. And of course, as part of that, we strengthen the rule of law, because when there's no accountability for these people, in Zulu would say, bayasidelela. They just feel like they've been allowed to do as they please. And those of us who have information, we must expose these networks and make sure that the law takes its course. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. Professor Thuli Madonsela, Professor Bani Pachana, Professor Adam Abib, Ms. Valesa Marudu, and Ms. Sirian Hapuji, thank you for your time. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for supporting the Academy of Science. And if I may put in a personal word, thank you for your friendship. I appreciate it very much. Thank you everyone who joined us on Facebook and on this platform. Have a wonderful, wonderful week and weekend. And vote sensibly, by the way. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Lovely to see you,
Bye.
colleagues.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you, Tato.
You're welcome. That was good.
Yes, awesome.
I can stop the recording, hey?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Power came on just on time.